Hello everyone. In this video, I am going to discuss the lab for week 7. In this week's lab, you are essentially going to be working on preparing the data that you have collected through your survey for analysis. Now today you're just kind of prepping that data and doing some things according to the instructions. Next week, you are actually going to analyze that data. So no data analysis today, just some preparation work in order to get your data ready to analyze next week. So for this assignment, you are going to submit 3 files as a group. The first file you're going to submit is just that raw data saved as an Excel file that shows all of the original unedited data that you pulled from your survey. So if you're in Google Sheets, you should be able to download that survey data as an Excel document. Please make sure to delete the data from the pilot survey. You are not using that in your analysis. You just want the survey that you collected once those surveys went live in their final form. In addition to that raw survey data in Excel, you're also going to need to provide an edited spreadsheet saved as a JUMP file that includes the original variables as well as any newly derived variables. So you need to have those original variables in there plus any newly derived created variables that you make. All variables named according to best practices. So remember, like we did in a previous lab, all of the variables in your JUMP file should be named according to best practices. You shouldn't have those full questions in there at the top first row. Instead, they should have a name that is according to best practices. Remember, we don't want spaces, weird characters and things like that. You want very short, brief names that help you communicate what it is that the variable is. And you want to make sure that all variable types are correctly specified for the entire data set. Now, a few of you missed points on this in a previous lab. You want to go to the very left side of the JUMP screen and you see you've got all of your variables listed there and there's little colored icons next to those variables. If you click on that colored icon, there's either a blue one for continuous data, there's a red one for nominal data, and I think the green one is for ordinal data. You want to make sure the correct one is specified there. If you don't tell your statistical software what kind of data you have, it won't know how to interpret that data. Then the third document you're going to need is a document that includes a number of things. So you want to include any justification for newly derived variables, any categorizing that you did, or recoding. So there are some things to keep in mind. Your categories should be collapsed in a logical way if there are insufficient numbers in some of the categories. So let's say that you use some sort of survey and there was a Likert scale and you had 5 different categories. They ranged from, let's say, 1 through 5. You're going to have a certain number of people in each category. Now, you want to look at those categories, you want to look at the distribution across those categories, and that's going to help you make informed decisions. If you've got a category, for example, category 1, and there's only a couple people in there, you're probably not going to want to leave that category with just a few people. So look at the distribution in those categories in JUMP and think about how you can collapse some of those categories in order to get a larger sample size in those different categories. This will help you with analyzing your data. It's just really difficult to analyze data when there's only a couple of people or maybe one person in a category. So please make sure to avoid categories with just a couple of observations. You want to collapse those in a way that makes sense for your data. If you have any categorical variables, which I think most of you do, you want to make sure that all of your variables, the data in those variables, should be coded in numerical form. Your JUMP spreadsheet should not have responses that are in text form. So if you had people indicate the level of physical activity and it was vigorous physical activity, no physical activity, you don't want that text in your JUMP spreadsheet, you want to code those levels of physical activity with numbers. So you could say 0 is no physical activity, 1 is little physical activity, 2 is medium physical activity, however that you want to code those. But you want to make sure all of your data is in numerical form. If you had data that had a range, maybe 5 to 6, 7 to 8, you want to make sure that that is in numerical form. Those ranges, 5 to 6, are categorical data. You need to code those ranges with numbers. So maybe your categories include less than 4 hours of sleep, 5 to 6 hours of sleep. That would be, that less than 4 could be a 0, the 5 to 6 could be a 1, the 7 to 8 could be a 2. You want to code those so you have actual numerical values for all of your data across all of your variables. You're going to need to keep track of how you code that data. So if you replaced less than 4 hours of sleep with a 0, you're going to need to document that. And in this lab, you are going to work on a data dictionary, which we'll get to in just a moment. You should also make sure that your ordinal variables are coded in a numeric way, like we just talked about, rather than character format. You want to make sure that they're coded such that JMP will recognize their inherent order. More specifically, as I already mentioned, you want to make sure that the variable type is specified correctly in your JMP document. So make sure that it's either coded as a continuous variable, it's coded as an ordinal variable, or it's coded as a nominal variable. You want to make sure your missing values are coded in a way that won't be confusing and confused for an actual value. So I highly recommend, if you do have any missing data, that it should be labeled with a period. Most statistical software will recognize a period as a missing value. So that's kind of the easiest way to do this. And so that's what I really recommend. And then you need to make sure that your dependent variable is binary. So some of you may have collected information on your outcome variable in a way that was not binary. That's okay. You need to recode that variable to make it a binary variable. So if you're not sure exactly how you're going to do that, I recommend looking at the distribution of your data and seeing what makes sense for you. It's also best practice to code those without the outcome of interest as a 0 and those with the outcome of interest as a 1. This is kind of universal across statistical softwares in terms of that coding. So every team's data is going to require different decisions based on your data. You just need to be clear on what kinds of recoding that you do and how that makes the best sense for your analysis. You want to make sure you justify your decisions. So in this document, you need to include a justification that includes a well-reasoned logical justification only for newly derived variables. So if you just recoded your levels of physical activity to 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, it's the same thing as your original variable, it's just in numerical form. You don't need to justify that. But if you took, 5 levels of physical activity and you condense those into a binary variable with 2 categories, meaning low physical activity and high physical activity, that is something that you would want to talk about and justify as to why you did that. Maybe there was such a small number in some of those categories that you collapsed them and it made sense to do it that way. Your justification needs to be complete. So if you have a newly derived variable, you need to discuss it and it needs to be clear. It needs to be written in a way that I can understand what you're saying. You also need a table that shows the distribution of all the variables of interest in your study, both your independent and dependent variables and any potential confounders that you're controlling for. You need to create them in this table in both original and categorized forms. So most articles, when you open them up, they start with a table 1 that shows the statistics that describe the study sample. These descriptive statistics are also called univariate distributions because they show the distribution for one variable at a time. These distributions refer to how the measures are distributed in a study sample. So typically when you see this, for continuous variables, To describe the distribution of a continuous variable, you often see that the authors present the mean and the standard deviation. This is typically what we do to show the distribution for a continuous variable. For categorical variables, where you have different categories for a particular variable, you present the number and the percent in each category. So if I had 5 categories, or let's say I had 2 categories, which is probably more likely, you'll show the percent in category 1 and the percent in category 2, as well as the numbers in each one of those. The number of people described for each variable should match the total number of people in your sample. For example, the sum of the people in each category of a categorical variable should match the total number of people in your sample. If not, you should note somewhere the number of people who are missing data on that variable. Maybe someone didn't fill out a certain question and so you don't have information on that person. You're going to need to note that as a footnote under your table. So research articles usually present the distributions only for the variables in their final recorded form. For example, if they had a continuous variable and they made it binary, they would just usually present the results of that final binary form of that variable. But for this assignment, I want you to present the distributions in their original and in their edited forms. This is because it helps you confirm that you recoded things correctly. So you didn't, exclude someone, for example. It just helps to make sure you ended up with the right number of people in your recoded categories. So let's say that I originally had 5 categories for physical activity and I recoded those down to 2 categories or even 3 categories. I want to make sure I include in my table the number and the percent of the people in those 5 original categories. And then I'm going to also include the number and percent of the people in those recoded 3 categories. I can then compare those to make sure the total sample or number of people is the same, just to confirm I didn't drop anyone when I recoded that data. So your table needs to include all the relevant variables, your independent variable or variables, your dependent variable or variables, and your confounders that you're looking at. You need the original and the newly recoded forms if you did any recoding and change those categories. It needs to present all the distributions correctly. So if you have a continuous variable, you're going to present the mean and the standard deviation. If you have a categorical variable, you need to present the number and percent in each category, and your table should be neatly formatted. You're also going to include a data dictionary. Your data dictionary will include all of the variables in the JMP file. It should follow the data dictionary format provided previously. So go back to your previous lab and take a look and see what that data dictionary format looked like. And it should provide correct information for all variables, including information on which variables were derived from which other variables. So for example, if I took a continuous variable called BMI and I recoded that into a binary BMI variable, and maybe I called it BMI underscore bin for binary, in my description or my description of that BMI underscore bin variable, I'm going to need to note that that variable was derived from the variable called BMI. You will lose points if you don't specify where new variables with new different numbers of categories, where those variables were derived from. So please make sure that is in your file. So in addition to that data dictionary, which you are creating for your own data, you're also going to need to make sure that everything is formatted appropriately. So please make sure you have 1-inch margins, 12-point font so I can actually read it. And justification and table should be in portrait orientation. Sometimes students struggle with this, so don't worry too much actually about the portrait orientation. As long as your table is legible and I can read it, that's really what I care about. And the data dictionary and landscape orientation, again, some students have difficulties with Microsoft. I know sometimes it doesn't want to comply with making one page into landscape. If you can't get it into landscape, it's okay. I just want to be able to read your data dictionary and actually view everything in it. So After completing this assignment, your team should be ready for your lab next week when you're actually going to start analyzing your data. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out to me. I am planning on having extended office hours until 3:30 on Wednesday. And again, if anyone in your group is able to, if you want to pop into the Thursday lab, you are welcome to attend that lab if you are available. Even if it's just one person from your group that attends who can ask questions and then take those questions back to the rest of the group, that is okay with me as well. Your whole group does not have to be there, but I do want to make myself available to you if you do have any questions.